Hi, thanks, Nick. It's nice to be here on the other coast. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so this is the talk today, and a couple of disclosures. I work for Microsoft, obviously, and I'm also on the board of EuroHealth, which is a small startup. But these companies do not meet the ACCME definition of an ineligible company. So the agenda for today's talk is I'll give you an overview of Microsoft's philanthropic AI for Good research lab. I'll talk about the promise of AI in medicine and give some examples of the work that the lab has done around clinical care applications, population health applications, and shared decision making. I'll talk about the potential for large language models, but also kind of balance that with some perils to consider and some hope for the future. So a brief overview of the lab. Our lab, the AI for Good lab, is part of Philanthropies. It's led by Juan Lavista, um, who's a corporate vice president, also the chief data scientist for Microsoft. These are the members of the lab that report up to Juan, and there's another person that's joined recently called named Inbal Becker. The lab works in three broad areas: sustainability, humanitarian action, and health. And we came out with a book that you can get on Amazon if you would like. The forward is from Brad Smith. Juan answers directly to Brad Smith, who is the vice chair and president of Microsoft. Um, so the lab is about a total of, I think, 45 or 50 people. About 20 something of those are data scientists. And again, we work in sustainability, humanitarian action, and health. I, as the only physician in the group, and the only one with kind of a medical background at all, I run the health portfolio within this lab. And so the way it works is we have a not-for-profit organization, as Nick pointed out. A number of projects we've recently had have been with UW folks, but we work with not-for-profit organizations, meaning .govs, .edus, and .orgs, wherein someone will contact me, or we will come up with kind of a research project. We then assign one of the data scientists to this research project, and we conduct the research, and we publish the research for others to consume. So it's very much a research organization. It's a proof of concept kind of an organization. So in fact, we're working with this is kind of in your guys' area, I think. We're working with Johns Hopkins University, where they've done a lot of work in pancreatic cancer. And so we're trying to use slides, pathology slides to identify what type of pancreatic cancer is in the slide. I guess, I'm a psychiatrist by training, so I don't know pathology slides that well, but there are, I guess, like 100 or some odd different types of pancreatic cancer. What we did is try to, use AI to evaluate the slides and align them with the probabilistic uh, uh, estimate of what type of cancer it was, and figuring that we focus on the, I think, 10 or 12 cancers that are the most common ones, with the thought that being that the less common ones will need a pathologist to look at them anyway and to review them. So that's the kind of work that we generally do. The areas of interest in health that we have are computer vision, so segmentation of organs and cancers, edge use of AI for diagnostics. Again, we're very much proof of concept. So we will work with a not-for-profit organization, come up with an algorithm or a process that, again, we publish in the medical literature. We publish any code to GitHub. And then it is up to the partner to take the next steps to get that into kind of production if they so desire. In the public health arena, we look at social determinants of health for city planning and decision making, and do large data set analytics, in particular around maternal fetal health and sudden unexpected infant death syndrome, with some colleagues at Children's Hospital, part of in Seattle. And then we also focus on large language models where it's obviously useful for data summarization. And we have done a study examining board question generation, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So I'll talk about the promise of AI in medicine and give some examples again of what the lab has done. As you know, an economist, one thing I worry about is this potential provider workforce shortage. And this is, I think, most acute in low and middle income countries. So the question, but it also is actually quite a problem in rural America. So one of the ideas is, can we use AI to expand the provider workforce kind of virtually in a fairly rapid way? I was at a conference about 2 years ago, and it was a neurology conference. I was there for whatever reason. I was giving a talk, and someone was talking about developing a neurology workforce in Ghana. And so they described kind of the plan, and their plan was to expand medical schools, expand neurology residencies, expand hospital wings in particular that had some capacity to deal with neurology and stroke in particular. And so, you know, I kind of raised my hand and said, what are you going to do for the next 20 years? Because that's a 20-year project, right? So the question is, might we be able to use AI to expand the provider workforce much more immediately, again, in areas and for diseases which might be amenable to that. So the first example I'll give is that of retinopathy of prematurity. Retinopathy of prematurity is increasingly diagnosed as children survive prematurity. It's the leading cause of lifelong blindness in kids and has a prevalence of 5 to 8% in high-income countries, but up to 30% in low and middle-income countries. It's you know, it's increasingly diagnosed, but it's a long-standing disease. Stevie Wonder has retinopathy of prematurity as his cause of blindness. So it's been around for quite some time. But again, it's because kids are surviving, it's more prevalent. Uh, the challenge with retinopathy prematurity is you can't just screen once. You need to screen repeatedly over, I think, like 15 months or 18 months. It's treatable with lasers and medications by pediatric ophthalmologists who happen to be a very scarce specialty in low and middle income countries and also in the US. So the question here is, might we use AI to effectively expand the pediatric ophthalmology workforce? So what we did is we worked with a group of folks in Colombia and Mexico and Brazil, where this is kind of an issue, and we found that community health workers could dialyze infants' eyes, use this kind of strange contraption that could link to their head and take a video of their retina. Uh, and then there was an automated, so we created using AI an automated immediate quality check of the video to determine whether there were adequate retinal frames, if it was blurry or the kid was moving or whatever, to figure out if that was the case. If it was inadequate, while the kid is still potentially sedated and when eyes dialyze, they could go back and redo a video. Once we got an adequate set of retinal images, we would align that with a proportion, and determination of whether it was the frames indicated that the patient had retinopathy of prematurity. In this case, the model predicted retinopathy of prematurity with 75% confidence. Then that you could push the send button that would send the 10 best frames to a pediatric ophthalmologist for verification and feedback. And then that feedback went back into the process for improving that overall algorithm. So here, you know, if you think about kind of expanding a provider workforce, if a pediatric ophthalmologist had been spending 80% of their time screening and 20% of their time treating, and you could flip that, right? If you could flip it to they're spending 20% of their time screening, with screening massively enhanced and the right patients getting to them quickly through an algorithm like this, then you've effectively kind of quadrupled the provider workforce essentially overnight. And so then they could spend a greater proportion of their time treating. Like I said, we published these papers, and so this was published in JAMA Network Open. A second example is leprosy, which is relatively common in certain low and middle income countries, and particularly among the impoverished. There are about 200,000 new cases a year. Those who get leprosy are stigmatized and ostracized. Dermatologists are scarce medical specialists uh, who can identify and diagnose and treat leprosy, but untreated, it can cause disfigurement. So the same question kind of, can we use AI to improve diagnostic screening for leprosy in low resource areas, thereby kind of giving the dermatologists the patients that are most likely to have leprosy and not making them spend as much of their time screening. So here we would just take a picture, again, from just a smartphone, and add a clinical questionnaire that could be filled out by a patient or a community health worker. Together then with certain indicators here, with thermal sensitivity and loss being the most kind of uh, predictive answer that a patient could give, but also whether they're nodules, paresthesias, gender, things like that. And then that would predict whether or not the patient had leprosy, whether the lesion was leprosy. And there was an automated then referral to a dermatologist if there was a high probability of leprosy. And here too, we published this in Lancet. Public health applications. So there were a couple of clinical applications thinking about expanding the workforce in low resource settings. Public health applications. One thing we did was predicted childhood malnutrition in Kenya. It's a chronic problem in some sub-Saharan Africa. There's survey data that are collected that capture kind of the proportion of kids that have malnutrition, either severe or moderate. But these are lagging indicators. So the survey data, are collected, say, in January. It takes a month or so to clean them. They might get out to an administrator in March or April. So 3 or 4 months later, you find out, yes, in this sub-county of Kenya, there were this many kids who had malnutrition. So you guys know that, malnutrition, particularly in infants and toddlers, can lead to lifelong problems with development and brain development. And so, might there be a way to use these data and satellite data to predict malnutrition rates in anticipation of when they come, as opposed to in reaction to when it is evident? So we did that. So we ran several models looking at 1 month prediction, 3 month prediction, and 6 month prediction. Used a variety of indicators, including the clinical factors from DHIS as a predictive part of the model, but also sub-county indicators. I think there were 350 different sub-counties, but very importantly, gross primary productivity from satellite data. We're partners with Planet, and they collect data all the time. Gross primary productivity kind of is an indicator of how the agricultural land is producing at a particular point in time. And by incorporating those different factors, we found out that gross primary productivity was a marked improvement in the predictive value, and we could predict with pretty good accuracy, certainly within 1 month, but even 6 months in advance, what the childhood malnutrition rates at the sub-county level, which was really important. So again, if you think you're an administrator in Kenya, if I can anticipate 6 months in advance where there's likely malnutrition, instead of then kind of coming in after the fact to try to treat kids who've already had malnutrition that's been documented for multiple months, I can anticipate a surge in malnutrition and bring resources to bear to address that issue before it happens as opposed to after. We published this in PLOS One. A second kind of public health intervention is to identify high impact social determinant of health interventions. So, folks on the call probably know that social determinants of health can account for, depending on who you read, between kind of 60 and 80% of overall health status, with clinical care kind of impacting maybe 10% of health status. So, we know that modifying social determinants of health for individuals can lead to improvements in health status. And so, through a collaboration with Novartis Foundation, New York University, and Weill Cornell, uh, and the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene in New York City, we have developed this AI for Healthy Cities project within New York. We're also working this consortium in several large cities, including Lausanne, Helsinki, and Singapore, with the hope that we might have future application in low and middle income countries. The key question we're trying to answer here is, might we use local social determinants of health data and AI to help policymakers determine which SDOH interventions might have the most impact on cardiovascular risks for particular geographies? So the idea here is, in a city like New York or Seattle, if you just say their social determinants of health are a problem, we want to use a shotgun approach to improve social determinants of health across every part of the city. That may not be the best use of funds. The particular areas of the city might be more responsive from a return to investment on health perspective if we focus on a particular social determinant of health in that area and perhaps a different one in a different area. So what we did, again, as proof of concept, is we used the CDC Places data, and for, I think, I can't remember how many, 30,000 census tracts across the United States, excluding those of New York City. And by using those census tracts, SDOH data from those census tracts, and what was the known diabetes prevalence in this case, we created an algorithm and then predicted diabetes rates in New York City at the census tract level. And on the left-hand side, we can see the actual observed diabetes prevalence, and then the predicted diabetes prevalence using a narrow variable set of, I think, 8 indicators, and then the predicted diabetes prevalence on the right using, I think, a total of 20 variables, something like that. And we found tremendous correlation with R squared of, I think, 0.7 here. And so the key thing here is that, as kind of a first step, we can use social determinants of health to predict then diabetes at the census tract level pretty accurately. Importantly, we can also look at, again, each of those dots is a census tract in New York, at the relationship between particular social determinants of health and diabetes prevalence. So these are so-called SHAP values on the y-axis, and the x-axis has these different kind of measures. And we find that things like, if the percentage of the population in the census tract on the upper right, as the percentage of the population that's getting SNAP benefits goes up, or high school education or less goes up, we find that diabetes prevalence goes up. Broadband, as broadband goes up, diabetes prevalence goes down, right? Walkability, as walkability goes up, diabetes prevalence goes down. So we can imagine then that policymakers might be able to use these different social determinants of health, and target the individual dots for those at the highest risk of developing diabetes, with different interventions designed to reduce diabetes for that population. And we publish this in BMJ Public Health. Now I'll talk about using large language models to enhance training opportunities. Uh, what we did is we partnered with the American Association of Ophthalmology, or ophthalmologists, who who kind of oversee board question generation, and we wondered whether we could use large language models to generate high quality board-like questions for that population. The rationale driving this is that generation of board questions is time consuming and expensive. It requires that you have accomplished, expensive board certified specialists, in this case, ophthalmologists, and indeed, ophthalmologists with particular specialties like in cornea, retina, what have you. And those ophthalmologists need to be facile at writing questions. These are all multiple choice questions, and they need to incorporate recent findings, right? Because in medicine, knowledge is always changing. So we don't want to do board questions for stuff that's 50 years old. We want to be current. So they have to incorporate new knowledge as it's been developed and generate questions that are then bantered about these groups of ophthalmologists to create kind of an ideal question. Uh, the challenge here is, again, this is time consuming and expensive. So those living in remote areas like low and middle income countries might not have access to such testing. And so we wondered whether these large language models trained on board certification materials might generate high quality board like questions quickly, cheaply, and innumerably, right? There's not a limit. If you say generate 1,000, it could potentially generate 1,000, and they would be novel um, and useful for people kind of wanting to test themselves. Um, the overall, while this may seem fairly narrow, we're just dealing with ophthalmology board questions. Obviously, from a proof of concept perspective, you could then apply this to any kind of board where in medicine, but also to any kind of profession that requires ongoing educational updates where the knowledge base changes. So lawyers with new laws, CPAs with new tax laws, things like that. You can imagine using the same kind of method to generate questions for them. So they could self-train and even use these for formal evaluation. So we trained the LLM on ophthalmology board materials. We used one-shot production, which was kind of a limitation um, uh, in that the comparison group was those questions that were generated by the ophthalmologists, right? And they had chances to go around and change the questions and kind of double check and make sure it made sense among their group. Ours, we did not do that. We just kind of corrected any minor grammatical errors that we found and said, generate to the LLM, generate a five question uh, multiple question uh, question, multiple response question with one correct response, and also as a side, we could say why this is a good response, this is the correct response, and this is the wrong response. So we did this. We compared our LLM generated questions to human generated questions, and with the people who wrote the questions uh, being the evaluator. So what we did is we randomly or mixed the human and LLM generated questions. We asked these people who generate these questions, the humans that do this, to look at the questions and evaluate the quality of the questions across different subspecialties, and to see whether they thought the questions were of high quality, both human written and LLM generated. And also, we asked them to kind of as a side note to say, do you think this is a LLM generated question or a human generated question? Here's what we found. The human expert committee is on the left in the darker bar, and the LLM is on the right in the lighter bar. We found no statistically significant differences. The pathology oncology was close, but no statistically significant differences in this overall median combined score, which is a measure of the overall quality of the question. So they're very similar, much quicker to generate. And again, you could generate an infinite number of these if you so chose. Interestingly, I mean, one of the concerns might have been, well, are they just kind of finding out what the questions already were and copying those, and that's why they look good? And the answer was no. The similarity score, a lower score, and below 60 means it's dissimilar. And we found that the vast majority of the questions were dissimilar um, from the questions that the humans generated. So, and they couldn't tell with any consistency what was human generated, which was large language model generated. So this we published in JAMA Ophthalmology fairly recently. So that's kind of some examples of what the lab has done in these three areas of computer vision, public health, and large language models. We have a lot of other stuff that are in the book, and I actually have a report that I could send to folks if they were interested that kind of summarizes what we found in the last 5 years of the project. But so now I want to talk about the potential for large language models in everyday clinical care. And for me, I worked at Dartmouth for many years. That was my kind of academic background before joining Microsoft about 7 years ago, and about 4 years in the current role. At Dartmouth, we were pretty into, in the public health school, we were pretty into quality and safety, and I did a lot of work in both of those areas. And so I was kind of enamored with the concept of value, which is defined by quality divided by costs. And the new quality can be then divided into kind of three different areas: improving the patient experience, improving the provider experience, and equitably improving care quality and health outcomes, all divided by a reduced per capita care costs. So if you improve the numerator, any of those three, and or keep those the same and reduce per capita costs, so decrease the denominator, you've enhanced value for a clinical population. And so this is the quadruple aim. I think the triple aim was developed by Don Berwick in the late 90s, and the quadruple aim, where they kind of added equity in the provider experience, was developed a little bit later. So that's the goal, in my humble opinion. If we're applying large language models or artificial intelligence to healthcare, we need to improve value by addressing specifically at least one of these quadrants, right, in the correct direction. So I'll give you some kind of examples of how I see the AI and large language models being potentially helpful in a variety of clinical aspects. This is a diagram we used a lot while at Dartmouth. It was kind of the process of care where we have a group of patients that go into entry and assignment into a healthcare system and orientation with an initial workup and a plan for care. They then receive whatever care they need, whether it's acute, chronic, preventive, or palliative care. And you have patients who then exit that system or have had their needs met at some eventual times. And sometimes they will come back, right? Particularly maybe if they're chronic care and they need to uh, iteratively engage in the system. So, and one could measure this in time one and time two, thinking about different quadrants: biological, functional, expectations, experience versus expectations, and costs, and measure that to determine value over time. So if we think about this as the care process, we have already seen, I think this is where I have heard a lot of people talk about the effectiveness of their use of artificial intelligence is really in backroom operations. So it's helpful for scheduling and coordinating, letter writing, particularly with approvals or countering denials, and summarizing record content. When I started in my residency and in med school, right, we had these huge stacks of written notes that you couldn't read, and it was impossible to go through to understand a patient's kind of history. I think LLMs, one thing they're like tremendously good at is summarization. So the record content can be fed into it and can provide very nice summaries, and even identify some of the challenges that we've had with electronic medical records, which is right. If you put something into the electronic medical record, it's very tough to get rid of it, even if it's wrong, because it just gets copy pasted and forwarded, right? So we might be able to contrast uh, what the record says and what certain things are to kind of get at truth here. So backroom operations has been, different healthcare systems I've talked to have found that incredibly helpful, and providers have found that pretty helpful because these are things that the providers did not necessarily go to school to learn. And here, I think, so for all of these kinds of things, the patient experience improves, the provider experience improves, outcomes probably improve and certainly don't go down, and it becomes more efficient. So there's actually potentially more throughput, or a minimum patient, providers can spend more time actually with their patients, engaged with their patients, than doing these backroom operations kind of things. Uh, a second area I think where large language models are pretty helpful is providing understandable self-care guidance. So if we think about patients who are getting acute care or chronic care or preventive care or palliative care, um, when, if you do just a typical search for instance, I put, how do I manage diabetes, in a search engine, right? And you get a bunch of advertisement. You don't get anything kind of helpful for a patient to actually do anything. They have to sift through stuff. They might be being sold all sorts of supplements and stuff that's nonsense. And so it's not helpful to them. It doesn't kind of help achieve any kind of a goal. If you ask the same question to Copilot, how do I manage diabetes? It actually gives a very nice and accurate summary that then asks the patient, would you like more detailed information on any of these points? So my sense is that this can be quite helpful for patients as they engage in the healthcare system in low resource settings. These kinds of things through Bing or through Google or whatever, if you're using kind of an AI enhanced model, can provide very good information on management of chronic diseases that, as everyone knows, is kind of the current and upcoming problem in the world, right? How do you manage this stuff? And by having patients self-manage through help through an LLM with good advice, we can offset some of the pressures on the healthcare system so that patients don't have to constantly come in and have these questions kind of answered. They can get them answered on an ongoing basis through chatbots or through some kind of a Copilot product. Here, again, I think the patient experience is enhanced. They have 24/7 access to this at essentially free cost. Provider experience is enhanced. Some of the routine, somewhat more mundane care is being offloaded to a bot. Care outcomes and quality is improved, particularly as these are monitored by reliable healthcare providers and healthcare systems that can verify that this is the right advice. So patients are getting the right advice, and then costs go down. There's less pressure on the healthcare system, fewer visits, more self-care, and probably better regulated outcomes, like whether it's diabetes or hypertension or CHF, whatever you're looking at, that may prevent unnecessary visits and unnecessary hospitalizations. One important thing that I got involved in while at Dartmouth was around shared decision making, uh, which is helping patients kind of decide whether to obtain care. Uh, we considered in a paper large language models that might be large language model responses to pre-prompted queries that are available to patients that use kind of updated, high quality published data on treatment outcomes for preference sensitive conditions. And so questions you could ask a large language model include, what are the treatment options for a patient like me? So, as you folks know, there might be a whole slew of treatment options, but they may not apply to a particular patient, a particular kind of a setting, or with particular comorbidity. So, for a patient like me, what are the treatment options? What are potential outcomes for a patient like me? What questions should I ask my provider when I'm considering whether or not to have this intervention? And for a provider, we consider that the same set of questions uh, might be helpful, and it actually would be helpful in drafting a letter to the patient with answers to those questions so the patient and their family could get answers to these particular questions in a systematic and easily understood way. So here too, I think this improves the patient experience. The provider has this support, kind of decision support around different options that a patient might have. Care quality and outcomes goes up. Patients, tend to have better outcomes when their patient preferences are aligned with their choices. And then the costs might go down because you're getting less of a burden on the healthcare system, and kind of the best first shot at what patients actually want. And so we published this. I guess I didn't capture which journal this is in, but we published this not too long ago. So these are all great things and great potentials for AI and large language models in their application to healthcare and medicine. But I think there are some potential perils to consider. Um, First, I mean, we see all of this, uh, a lot of hype going on. There's these hype cycles that occur in technology. We might be in the midst of one now. I often will ask people if I'm giving a talk like this uh, live. I ask people to raise their hand if they think AI is going to kill us all or going to save us all. It's kind of a 50-50 split. So there's a lot of confusion about what AI is going to actually do and how it's going to be used. And when you have partial truths and a lot of hype and a lot of jargon, you can get massive confusion. So I think one of the challenges is kind of almost addressing misinformation around AI in healthcare and trying to be realistic about what it can do and what it can't do and what we need to study further to understand how it might be best used. I think there's a danger of haphazard application of AI. People get all excited about it. There's a great quote from Bill Gates. This is the first rule of any technology used in a business is that automation applied to an efficient operation will magnify the efficiency. And the second is that automation applied to an inefficient operation will magnify the inefficiency. And in my experience, again, studying healthcare systems at Dartmouth, I'm not clear that healthcare is the most efficient system in the world. We think that in the US, there's maybe 30% waste built into the system. And so, automating everything is not going to help with efficiency, and it actually may make things worse. So I think a targeted way of using AI with a thoughtful and strategic effort, understanding that AI has its own costs, and as Nick and I were talking a little bit before this, he said that the efficiencies that AI is producing, it seems to unleash some time for people to think about what's the next use of AI, right? So we need to be thoughtful and strategic and demonstrate its effectiveness before going on to the next thing. One of the challenges that I see, particularly in the literature, is that we chase perhaps the wrong metrics. So there are lots of measures of model fittingness, which tends to be how the data scientists kind of approach these questions. But, and so you get an area under the curve and sensitivity and specificity, and those are all great things to have. But the key things are, is it clinically meaningful? Is it worth the investment? So is it going to have a big enough impact on your patient population to warrant the investment? And really importantly, can anyone support the monitoring? The I think a lot of companies are selling these AI products and say, "Oh, you just take it off the shelf and apply it." I don't think that's a very smart thing to do. I think you need to monitor the effectiveness of the AI. You actually need to do it kind of like a quality improvement project with a pilot. You need to evaluate the pilot and then have continuous monitoring to make sure that the AI product is doing what you anticipated it to do originally. I see some challenges when there's not an expert human in the loop. Most data scientists are not medically trained, and so we need to have clinicians and patients in the loop throughout the modeling process. I've seen too often that there are, a group of folks who do not work in healthcare have come up with this great idea that they think will be transformative, and that all that needs to happen is the physicians need to change their entire workflow, right? And it's just not going to happen. So things can be very good ideas, but pragmatically impossible to do. They they may, if it's black box kind of AI, they may not be able to explain what's happening, and you might find bizarre kind of relationships that don't kind of play out in a pathophysiological understanding of disease that it should. So you need to have an expert human in the loop, and I think patients need to be involved here as well because they need to kind of verify that this is something that they would believe in. I think to persuade physicians in particular and providers, we need to use interpretable AI models and tools like generalized additive models and SHAP values that helps the clinicians and experts understand the model and what's driving the model. The black box approaches just kind of aren't going to work, I don't think. And a third big challenge I see is that models are invariably developed and tested retrospectively. So you use all of these past data and you develop a model based on that. There needs to be, again, piloting, testing for unintended consequences, and validation prospectively to make sure that the retrospective study kind of holds. Here's an example of SHAP values and how they can be useful in interpretation of a model. Here we're predicting 1 year lumbar disc herniation. And we have a SHAP value with the higher on either end indicating a contribution to the model overall, either positive or negative. And then, it's kind of the feature value goes from high, having more importance, kind of a greater effect size, if you will, at the top and low at the bottom. And then you can see that, most of the work is being done by these kind of four different metrics: the disability index, the duration of the back pain, previous surgery, and anxiety or depression. These contribute mostly. And so a spine surgeon might say, yeah, this kind of makes sense. And this might help them believe that the model, the predictive model about the surgical outcomes is kind of valid for a particular patient. And it could actually be interpreted in light of making a decision around a particular patient as well. I kind of mentioned that, there are costs of the AI is not just a one, you take it off the shelf and you put it in, and you forget about for 10 years. As everyone on the call probably knows, AI is developing exceedingly quickly, right? With new models, new big models coming out every few months, dramatic changes. I don't know if you guys have used uh, Copilot, which is, I get it from Microsoft, so I have used it. It is dramatically improved in the past couple of years, and is much more helpful now than it used to be. So when we think about implementing an AI algorithm to help manage our patients, we need to think about not only the initial cost, but ongoing cost of the management. So it's not a one-time effort. And I think, it includes an AI expert. The development and deployment should have an AI expert, like, more of a data scientist or an engineer, a subject matter expert, a practicing clinician, one who works in the relevant area. Again, to get beyond this, all I need to do is change all of my workflows. That's not going to happen. The key thing is it's pragmatic. How can I make it pragmatic so I can incorporate it into my workflow easily? A patient representative, perhaps an ethicist, to make sure that what we're doing is ethically based and maybe not biased. An IT expert, how do we integrate the AI algorithm into the IT system so it's available to these practicing clinicians, and perhaps even a finance expert to understand, what's the cost of this, what's the payback, what's the return on investment for this kind of thing. So these are a fair amount of expensive humans in the loop regularly over time. It's not a one-shot deal. They need to be iteratively involved in this process. So when we, again, if we think about, we don't do a shotgun approach, we do a strategic approach that focuses on patients who are, or patient populations that are most likely to benefit from the AI, and uh, and incorporate a management approach for the AI to ensure this doing what we want it to do over time. Here we kind of outline the process for safely and reliably implementing our AI into clinical settings. That includes the scoping, the data curation, the development, the model evaluation that goes back to a data curation in an iterative loop, the model deployment, and then the post-deployment refinement and evaluation. And we published this in Mayo Clinic Proceedings just, I think, last month or so. Finally, there are a lot of biases, right? That people, I think the biggest one that was recognized during COVID was that O2 saturation was differently measured in people with darker skin colors than lighter skin colors, and that led to some problems, right? So we need to anticipate biases and again, test the AI algorithm on a population in real time, going prospectively uh, in the population that's going to be served to make sure that it's effective. So that's developing new models on new populations. The off-the-shelf stuff needs to be really revalidated and, like referred to before, include local clinical experts and patients. And the data sets on which models are developed needs to be cleansed, even if others regularly use them. So we actually did an evaluation using multiple publicly available data sets of tympanic membranes to try to identify otitis media in Aboriginal kids. It's the chronic serous otitis media is the most common cause of deafness in that population. And so we use these different data sets. And we just kind of took them off the shelf and ran some models looking at them, and things were kind of goofy. We couldn't figure it out. So then we evaluated these different data sets from three different sources, hypothetically, and we found a substantial amount of duplication, both within data sets and across data sets. So, if you're doing testing and on a duplicate kind of image, it's not a good thing. You're going to overestimate the model. So and these were publicly available. They had been repeatedly published on, and they were flawed in effect, right? So I think there's a real need. I think sometimes when we get these publicly available data sets, we think, oh, they're great. The other people have used them. We still need to make sure that they're actually good data sets for evaluation. So, so those are kind of the maybe potential perils. Um, Hope in the future. So going forward, I think people are sometimes scared that they will be replaced. And I have this caveat that I don't think AI is going to replace providers, but providers who can use AI effectively will replace providers who cannot. AI is a new technology, just like a stethoscope was a new technology at one point. People who could adapt and use stethoscopes became better doctors and survived, whereas those who refused to use that kind of technology simply did not survive. Today's AI models will not be tomorrow's. Again, the field is changing so dramatically and so quickly that even if one feels it has a great AI model today, it will be modified and changed in relatively short time. We all, when we went to medical school, we took primum non nocere, first do no harm. That should always trump caveat emptor, which is I went to business school, and this is kind of the business school thing, which is let the buyer beware, right? We have a fiduciary relationship to our patients. We need to look out for them. We have a special knowledge that gives us kind of a knowledge differential above those patients. We need to use that to their benefit and not just to promote some kind of an AI algorithm. Prompt engineering, the way you ask the question and the question you ask really matters. Those of you who are fans of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy know this, right? You got to ask the right question to get an interpretable answer. This very much applies to the large language models. If you don't ask the question the right way, you may get something that doesn't make sense coming back to you. And finally, I think, and this is maybe a little controversial, but I think it's important to keep the comparisons fair. Too often, I've seen an AI algorithm that can kind of, be at 90% accuracy, but the physician group that's being compared, that the algorithm is being compared to, is at 94%. And so it's kind of like, well, I guess this AI algorithm failed. But I think frequently those physician panels that are compared to are kind of world experts. We all know the old joke that, what do you call the doctor that graduates last, or the person that graduates last in their medical school class? You call them doctor. There's huge variation in quality of providers in the US and across the world. And so I think we need to think more about the general population and their access to high quality care. And if we can operate an algorithm at 88 or 90%, that means that we're doing, for 89% of the population, that's an improvement. And so that needs to be considered when we interpret the performance of these models and again, make it fair compared to not some kind of idealized care that frankly no one has access to, but the care that people are actually currently getting and how can we improve the quality of care there. So I'll end with a little story about one of my favorite folks in the world. This guy's name is Gilbert Garcin. He's a Frenchman who ran a lamp factory in Marseille, France. I spent about a year in Marseille, France. Uh, and he worked in this factory from like age 25 to 65 when he retired. And he thought maybe he should find something to do in his retirement. So he took some trick photography courses, and here's an example of him, looking at us, and then him looking down at himself, looking at us. And here's one where he's focusing on one particular dot when he's surrounded by dots. And here's a fabulous kind of a Sisyphean effort of him, pushing this roller to wipe out the very steps that he himself is making. So I like this guy a lot because he has a big management career, clearly has a very good sense of humor. Clearly, he learned through management some of the um, foibles of management and how people behave. And he learned this new tool uh, and then is displaying in a very different fashion his management expertise to good humor, but also to kind of meaningful impact as well. And so I am hopeful that AI can be used in the same kind of fashion as Gilbert Garcin has used trick photography as a new way to move into your next career phase, a way that you can use what you've learned before and modify it and improve it maybe to both to improve, kind of express what it is you want to express, improve patient outcomes and achieve the quadruple aim, but maybe to have a little bit of fun too. So thanks for your attention. You can reach me here. There's a couple of websites that you can check out as well if you would like.
Thank you, Dr. Reese, for that great talk. There are two questions in the Q&A, which I could read aloud if you wanted. The first one is um, from Dr. Chen. How significant is the role of explainability in your work? Can robust clinical trial results offset limited explainability?
So explainability of the model, I guess.
Yeah, I think so.
So I guess I don't quite understand the question. Uh, so if you have a
So I
clinical
think
trial,
stated another way, can really great results from an AI system, from an AI-enabled system, uh, trump or kind of offset, let's say, limited or no explainability of that system?
can great result? No, I would worry about that because I think I get this kind of stuff. People pitch to me all the time. They say, "Oh, we have, here's our algorithm. We can't tell you what's in it, but there's a 50% reduction in mortality." To which I say, "That's not right. That's not true. You don't get that with one thing, right? Just experience says you don't get that. So in fact, that's probably hype and unvalidated. Not infrequently, people will also tell me, the same people trying to sell that product will say, I'm highly published, and I find out that they have two abstracts, and the abstracts are open trials without any kind of control.
Hmm.
So I worry a lot about it. I think explainability to me is a pretty important aspect of modeling. Yeah, and it should be consistent with if the question is, is it consistent with the clinical trial? I don't know if that means of the AI or whatever. Um, you know, I don't think I would do a clinical trial unless I understood what was under the hood.
And another question from Ray Monnet, Dr. Ray Monnet. What efforts are you making to educate the next generation of physicians on best principles and uses of AI? And I think this is a question that I have also is what have you seen has been effective in research and kind of clinical organizations for both, I think, educating, users, but also creating an environment where people are thinking about and innovating with AI? Like what is the base level of, like, what do we need to do in terms of like our organizational structure to encourage that kind of innovation?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, there are a variety of ways to go about that. I think, so we work and we fund the Vandershar lab at Cambridge University in England, where they create the AI revolutionaries of the future. Um, Michaela Vandershar has a strong belief that physicians need not become AI experts. It would be ludicrous, right? It would add to a 12-year education another 6 or 8 years. It would just take forever. We'd be in wheelchairs by the time we could treat someone, right? So we need to partner with AI experts who can very much understand the healthcare process and have enough knowledge on our side to understand what the AI is doing with these explainability characteristics, I think, embedded. So that is kind of for practical application. I think I see more and more in medical schools, right? They're offering some AI intro classes and how to actually use this. I think that's where the providers need to be taught how to use this. And one thing we've actually just launched within our group is something called the AI Economy Institute, where we're looking at the impact of AI on jobs and workforce development. The concern, which a lot of people are writing about, is that you kind of lose um, critical thinking skills sometimes. If you just rely entirely on AI responses, I mean, the things that you learn doing Scott as a intern and struggling with the differential diagnosis, or even as a researcher, struggling with the right questions, struggling to uh, understand unanticipated results from your study, uh, helps you become human and helps you figure out the next thing. If you skip that part, I fear a lot, and others do as well, that you just become a consumer of AI without any kind of critical analysis of the whether it might be reasonable or not. So I think, frankly, a little bit less on, how do I use AI, and it's more like maybe some on that, but how to critically appraise the AI output is the important thing because it continues, right? Even now, there's still hallucinations, there's still stuff that comes out wrong. It is absolutely true that same things happen with different providers, right? The same, you might have three providers see the same patient, and they will all have three different diagnoses. So there's not inconsistency within medicine, but the ability to critically appraise the output as something that's kind of believable and useful or not is very important to teach. So for me, I would teach those skills as well as kind of some rudimentaries of AI use. I don't think that providers need to know how the AI is actually constructed. They don't need to know that any more than they know the inner workings of an MRI, unless they're radiologists, right? Um, but they need to know kind of how and when to use it and how to appraise it. That's my sense. And that those skills should be taught actually starting even when, I mean, our group, the AI Economy Institute, is looking at K through 12 at that level, as well as through professional education and in an ongoing even CME way, because again, these things are changing so rapidly. It's important to be able to keep up with the newest stuff.